So, of course, we've long had machines, including various kinds of robots, that replicate human physical action. The idea behind AI and what AI is promising to do is to provide additional forms of cognitive ability, just like humans do when they do paperwork, when they make decisions. So the pitfalls or the concern are, of course, it may particularly help a few people gain more power and sway over most people. So it could become really deeply unequalizing.
Hello everyone, I'm Naf.
And I'm Grazielle Davi. Hi.
Welcome to Equals, the podcast about inequality. Today we'll be diving deep into something much bigger than just tech buzzwords, artificial intelligence or AI, and how it's shaping or potentially disrupting our world. As most of you know, AI is already affecting our political, economic systems, and also the way we connect with each other.
In today's episode, we will also tackle a critical question. Will AI exacerbate inequality, or could it help improve the issue?
We've got an incredible guest joining us, Simon Johnson. Simon is a professor of entrepreneurship at MIT Sloan and heads up their Global Economics and Management Group. He's also a Nobel Prize winner for his groundbreaking work on how institutions shape prosperity.
What an amazing work he does. Let's dive in.
Let's listen in. Hello, Simon. Really great having you on Equals podcast. Grazielle and I are very excited to be spending the next half hour with you discussing AI and inequality.
Nice to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Simon, AI is everywhere in the news these days, and there's so much excitement and fear around it right now. But before we dive into the big questions, let's start with the basics. How would you define AI for someone who isn't, a tech expert? And what are some of the main promises and problems of this technology? And why should everyone care about AI?
Now, I think that is the big question. And there are lots of definitions of AI and an enormous amount of marketing hype. So people are trying to sell you on different versions. But I think a short summary would be AI, artificial intelligence, is an attempt to replicate or duplicate in some fashion. The idea is to replicate some part of human cognitive function. So, of course, we've long had machines, including various kinds of robots, that replicate human physical action on a production line, for example, or carrying things, or moving us around country and between countries. We use machines to replace physical labor. The idea behind AI and what AI is promising to do is to provide additional forms of cognitive ability, just like humans do when they do paperwork, when they make decisions, when they interact with other humans and provide guidance. So the potential is AI could help us all do better. The pitfalls or the concern are, of course, that it may just help a few people, and it may particularly help a few people gain more power and sway over most people. So it could become really deeply unequalizing. And that, I think, would be a dramatically bad outcome.
Well, Simon, talking about inequality, in your book, Power and Progress, you bring this a lot. You demonstrate that technology doesn't automatically benefit everyone, as you're saying now. So what are the specific risks that artificial intelligence represents to inequality?
Well, the problem, Grazielle, that we've had, I would say particularly over the past 4 decades, is the way that digital technology has developed has in some countries been quite unequalizing. Now, I understand that in other countries it's been quite empowering. I understand that access to mobile phones and mobile money, for example, in Kenya has helped a lot of people. But if you look at what's happened in the United States and in other advanced industrial countries, people with a lot of education have had good income gains. People in the middle have been squeezed quite hard, and many middle-class jobs have been lost. And people have been pushed down to the lower end of the labor market, where people, for example, don't have a college degree. And surviving at that lower end of the labor market is really very tough. So the digital technologies that we've already experienced have had this unequalizing effect. The more recent arrival of, let's call it social media, Facebook and what we used to call Twitter and so on, have both further exacerbated those effects, but also add a lot of noise to the system. So democracies, again, in industrial economies, although I think this is true around the world, actually, quite sadly, democracies don't function like they used to and like they should because careful deliberation has been crowded out by massive amounts of noise and signal jamming and disinformation campaigns and so on. So artificial intelligence is arriving and the technology is developing very fast at a moment where we already have a very unequal world, a lot of inequality within the richer countries. This technology is being driven by a relatively few people. Let's call them West Coast or Silicon Valley men. I mean, there are some women and there are some people not on the West Coast of the United States, but predominantly it's white men on the West Coast of the United States that are establishing the vision and driving the technology. And what they want to produce at the moment, their vision, is something that's interesting and useful to them and to their market, which is other rich people on the West Coast of the United States and within the United States with money. And that suggests that the technology that comes to the world will be a technology shaped by that vision and by that initial market. And some of that could be useful to people. I mean, I'm not against technology. I'm not against innovation at all. I'm definitely not against AI. But I think the form of AI that is being produced by, let's call it the market forces, is not necessarily going to be helpful to most of the people in the world.
Are we already seeing signs of worker displacement or a growing divide between the super rich and the rest? Do you have numerical information on this?
Well, there's certainly plenty of discussion about displacing workers. One CEO who I spoke to not too long ago used the term, I don't like this term, let me be clear, but it's his term, not my term. He said the cut and paste workers will be the first to be fired. So cut and paste means that the workers have some routine or repetitive feature to their job. And a lot of this would be so-called white-collar workers, people working in offices, people who do paperwork, they do regulatory filings, they handle permits, they do other things that have some substantial repetitive element. So AI can already do a lot of those tasks. And AI is spreading to call centers, for example. It is definitely spreading to all forms of interaction with customers. Now, some of it makes customer interactions better. Some of it makes the people who work in call centers happier. But there's no question at the moment that you need fewer of these people. So the worker displacement, which is what you're asking about, is already underway. We have not yet seen that in the macroeconomic statistics, but I think we'll see it quite soon. So we're going to be seeing those effects and we'll see what happens to those people. And I think it's going to be difficult.
And just to close on this subject, I was using ChatGPT and making some questions, and the results seem to have a discrimination against Afro-descendant. Is it really the case or not?
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence that many generations of artificial intelligence have had pretty bad and deep biases or discrimination baked into them, in part because the data that's used to so-called train the models. So the models are based on a lot of previous human interactions. If those previous human interactions had bias in them, then the AI will be codifying those biases and repeating them. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. And there's been some efforts, including by my colleagues at MIT, to measure this and to find ways to make the biases more apparent and therefore correct for the biases. So humans have deep biases, Grazielle, as you know, in many places, including in the United States. And getting these out into the open and measuring them and finding ways to counteract them is smart and a good thing. So I think the point is, don't blindly accept the AI off the shelf. And particularly don't assume that an AI that's been, even one that's been trained and prepared properly for another country, don't assume that won't bring with it some discriminations that are perhaps not fully apparent to people in that other country, but are very painful to you in your country.
Simon, something that bothers me, that's always on my mind is, right now, who's really accessing and benefiting from AI? Assuming, the promises of AI, let's say around education or improving your economic system. I'm just afraid, it's mainly benefiting or it's being accessed by rich countries. Correct me if I'm wrong. So if so, what does that mean for poorer countries, especially in Africa? You see, my fear is, could AI make the gap between the North and the South, or between the rich and poor world, even wider?
Well, yes. I mean, to be completely blunt and answer your question directly, the way AI is developing currently absolutely could make the gap between North and South wider, could make it a lot wider, actually. But I think, within that, we should maybe, point to a couple of interesting potential complexities. First of all, obviously, if you don't have any kind of digital connection of any kind, you can't connect with AI and you can't utilize its potential. So let's be clear, and there's obviously billions of people who don't have that kind of connection or don't have enough connectivity. However, if you do have some connectivity, some of this software can be accessed anywhere in the world quite easily at low cost, and the cost is coming down. But I think there's another danger within that, Naf, which is that if this technology is developed for rich people in rich parts of the United States, which it certainly is, then you are accessing a technology that's been developed for them and for their preferences and for what people think they need, whether or not it's true. But that's what drives the vision, right? Now, when that comes to a low-income country, is that helpful? We'll see. Does it create jobs or displace jobs? Great question.
So on the topic of workers' displacement, Simon, one of the solutions being proposed is UBI, Universal Basic Income. But I can't imagine how that would work in poor or low-income countries, when ensuring even basic things such as, feeding people is a struggle. So what's your take on this, on UBI as a solution?
I think UBI is a dangerous solution. I mean, I like the idea. First of all, the claim there'll be a massive productivity gain and income of the world will be much larger given our current resources. Of course, that's appealing. Everybody wants a massive, bonanza for the world. That's not very likely to happen, and we're not seeing that in the data, to be quite honest. Now, it's early days. The technology is still changing, but there's no cornucopia around the corner as far as we can see. Now, even if there were big increases in productivity, is that going to be enough to generate enough income for people who lost their jobs and can't find new jobs to live happy, productive lives, for example, doing things they really enjoy rather than earning income? I don't think so. The numbers don't work. I was formerly, among other things, the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. And so, I like to look at numbers and I like to be pretty hard-headed about that. And often those truths are not the nicest, right? But I just don't see that in the data. But the other thing, Naf, is that if you really create a class of people, perhaps a large class of people who don't have jobs and just receive income, I fear that they will be very vulnerable politically. And you can see what's happening in the United States right now as we move along with another round of discussions about budgets and tax cuts and so on. The people who have power in this discussion are people who have jobs, people who have incomes, people who have status, and people who are relatively poor in the United States. For example, people who receive Medicaid, which is a medical assistance program for people who don't have much money, they are going to get squeezed pretty hard, I would say. So the politics of being on UBI are not good, certainly in the United States. I don't think they'd be good in many places. And I think also there's a dignity of work and a status of work. I fully understand that not all jobs are good jobs. There are some really bad jobs out there. And automating those jobs and making it so humans don't have to do dangerous, nasty, unhealthy things is a good idea. But I don't think a world where 80, 90, or even 50% of the people don't work, can't work, get UBI, I don't think they would live well. I don't think they'd enjoy it. And I think over time, their living standards would get squeezed more and more and more by the people who have jobs, who have status, and who have political power.
Yes, and you're talking about the cost of artificial intelligence. And we were wondering, for some years, it was the California coast boosting artificial intelligence. But just now, China has released DeepSeek and caused a huge impact on the stock market. What's your analysis of this release for artificial intelligence and for inequality?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's obviously a very fluid situation. So I'm happy to tell you my view today, but tomorrow I may need to change my view when new technology arrives. So certainly there is a global competition, and you're quite right. This is not only about, let's call it US big tech, which is disproportionately in California and the US West Coast. China is obviously also a player. Other countries may be players too. As far as we can see, it is mostly China versus the United States. But one of the points from DeepSeek, of course, is that it may be possible to train and develop really effective AI models without having to spend enormous billions of dollars on training. And in particular, you may be able to be what's called, in some context, a fast follower. So in other words, somebody spends $100 billion on a new AI model or approach, and you may be able to figure out how to adapt it to your local needs, even as a foundational model, sort of really fundamental in how AI works, for some millions of dollars. Now that would be pretty, that would certainly increase access in some senses. And I would also emphasize that the big money and the big competition is for those foundation models right now. There's presumably going to be a lot of applications, or people call them deployments, on top of those foundation models with regard to AI. And I think that in terms of access and what actually happens around the world, those deployments are immensely important. And they may well be they should be much cheaper than the foundation model, and hopefully more accessible. Of course, that doesn't necessarily deal with my other concern, which is what happens to the jobs. So if more people can access AI and displace more local white-collar workers more quickly, So automate those jobs away. Do they also create more new tasks that require expertise for the people who've been displaced by automation? That's the key. That's the key always to whether or not you get shared prosperity. So the question today is, first of all, the question you're asking, which is who has access to this technology and how much does it cost for an individual or a group of individuals or even a local company to access the technology. But then the second question is, what do they do with the technology? Obviously, they do something for themselves, otherwise they wouldn't use it. But is the social impact of that local use and further deployment and application of technology, is that something that boosts the creation of more good jobs for more people, including people who don't have a lot of education? Or is it something that actually leads to more inequality everywhere, including in middle and low income countries?
So, Simon, in addition to the social and economic implications, another issue being raised around AI is its environmental implication, which I actually try to follow closely. And the consensus seems to be, AI systems require massive amounts of energy and water, and this could, worsen climate change and environmental degradation. And you've compared this to the Industrial Revolution, where unchecked technology caused a lot of environmental damage. Do you think, governments and companies are paying enough attention to the environmental impact of AI?
To be honest, Naf, no, they're not. Well, actually, they do pay attention, but it's a kind of lip service attention. If you talk to the people who are leading these companies, they'll say things like, well, yes, we do use quite a lot of energy today, but our energy use will come down and we will come up with these amazing solutions because our AI is going to be so smart that will greatly both conserve energy, reduce the amount of electricity that we need, and that will find brilliant new solutions to the problems of climate change. I think that's wishful thinking. Well, I know it's wishful thinking. I think that the environmental damage needs to be taken seriously. Of course, on the issue of energy, NAF, a lot depends on how you generate the energy. If you're doing it with renewables and investing in renewables, that is different from digging up and burning more fossil fuels. I think your point about water is really interesting and that particularly requires more attention. I don't think it's received it. And there's also these fascinating issues about, to what extent can we share technology and leverage the different geographic characteristics of various places. So, for example, if you put your data center somewhere really cold, you need a lot less energy because, a big part of the problem of data centers is you have a lot of computers, they heat up, and so you need to cool it. So northern parts of Scandinavia, for example, are well aware that they have a real potential here. Is there a way to use those locations to provide ethical, helpful, pro-worker forms of AI to the world? Because if you have to build data centers in low-income countries those countries that are also quite hot on average most of the year, for example, that's going to be both more expensive and more environmentally damaged per unit of computation.
We have already talked here about the effects that AI could have on work, on inequalities, on climate, on environment. What needs to be done to ensure that it benefits everyone and not just a privileged few? What deliberate actions can governments, organizations, or even global institutions take to address these risks?
Well, Grazielle, I could give you some fine words here, and I could talk about, ethics and norms and values and resolutions and, summit meetings and so on and so forth. But I think I should be honest with you, which is this is a market-driven process in which the United States is at the center. And in the United States today, it's all about money. There will be no government regulation of AI, partly because these companies are very rich and powerful and they give money to politicians and they get good seats at President Trump's inauguration. And partly because this administration, and actually, to be honest, a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans in Washington, D.C., where I live and spend much of my time, on both sides of the aisle, they're convinced that quote unquote, winning the race to build AI is important for national prosperity and national security in the United States. Which leads me then to the following bluntness, if you don't mind, which is if you really want to shape the direction of technology, you have to become a market. You have to find ways to pool your purchasing power. And I made this point to some friends of mine who were in civil society in Indonesia. And they came to visit MIT very, very, very soon after ChatGPT was released, the first version. And they were so excited about the technology and being able to use it. And they had all these ideas about how it could benefit Indonesia. And I said to them, look, it might move in a direction that helps poor farmers in Indonesia, which was one of the topics that they proposed. But that would be luck, good fortune. And that's not usually how the world works. But if you get your farmers together with other farmers and you form a big buying coalition and say, look, we are 1 billion people around the world and we need this, this, and this. And if you build it, we will buy it. Then you get the attention of the tech companies. A lot of what is built in this sector, and this is true of the US technology sector, particularly around software, but also in general, a lot of what's built is what venture capitalists think will be important in the future. Where will be the market? Who has the dollars? And so I know this sounds crass. I know people may feel it's unfair. And I feel bad about this. But on the other hand, this is the world we live in. And I think part of my job is to speak truthfully and honestly in my own personal perspective. I don't think I can do anything else, actually, at this stage of my life. So I think that people need to get organized. They need to decide what they want. And, economists love to go on and on about unintended consequences. But my preference at this moment is to stress the importance of intended consequences, which means if you don't ask for things, if you don't imagine what you can invent, if you don't have a proper deliberative process and a legitimate sort of arrival at whatever you need in terms of consensus for what you want to be built, what you want to achieve, what do you want technology to do, Grazielle? If you don't have that vision and that pitch and some money behind it, as in, if you build it, we will buy it, then it's not going to happen. There's different versions of this point in different sports, but perhaps the one that works best around the world is for soccer. If you don't shoot at the goal, you don't score, right? So you have to shoot on goal. Where are the shots on goal from low and middle income countries? If you're fragmented, if you're low income, if you're dealing with a lot of day-to-day problems, it's much harder to take those shots on goal. But if you pool your efforts and articulate the problem and show people what you need, then I think you can get to some better solutions.
I must confess that this last answer from Simon had a huge impact on me because for many years I have been working with a human rights framework. So the only way I can think today, I guess, is how can I use the human rights framework to advance this subject? And then the idea that the power comes from the people, and when people move, they can move government. If I stop thinking that government can do something like regulate, this kind of puts down the perspective I used to work. I do understand this idea of we should do it by ourselves, but is that really we should work as if we are the market?
Look, I don't at all necessarily mean to be discouraging or disparaging of efforts like your own or the human rights framework. I think that's very important. It's a huge contribution. It's obviously something that's developed. We didn't have that 100 years ago. I don't think we really had it 50 years ago, honestly. So I think it's a very good thing for the world. And it's also been massively influential. I mean, I've been teaching in American business schools for about 35 years. And the change in the mindset of these young business people, the people who come to my classes are very international, but there's a lot of Americans in there and people from all around the world. And 35 years ago, they were pretty much all about money. And now they want to do good things for the world. Now, they do have student loans. They do want to get a job. They do want to work their way up in some corporate hierarchy. But their attitude to the world and their compassion for the world is very different. And I think the human rights framework, honestly, Grazielle, has been an important part of that. But I mean, I just wish I didn't have to say this. Or I wish it weren't true. But the premise of the early 20th century and the reaction to what some people call the second industrial revolution was to say, right, the private sector can do some good things, but also gets out of control and can bring us great damage. The economy can collapse. So let's have the government set up as a counterbalance to the private sector. The problem, Grazielle, is twofold, right? One is that the private sector, big, powerful people in the private sector often capture the state and use it to their own end. That we've seen that struggle for decades. But the other problem, Grazielle, is that, the government can be taken over by people with a particular ideology, and they can deliberately and completely dismantle all the government counterweights to what the private sector wants to do. So if the only channel for the people's influence is through the government, there's a problem. But I think multiple channels, Grazielle, channels directly to companies, channels to other people, that's what I would recommend. And I think if government becomes a single point of failure, then you have a problem because single points of failure always fail.
Oh, thank you. That's very insightful.
It feels like, the risks are bigger than the benefits that we're getting from AI. Are there things that give you hope, Simon? Are there examples of people, communities, or governments doing things right, to ensure AI is used for the good of everyone?
Yeah, honestly, Naf, it's all in play right now. So the best news is this kind of conversation. I have lots of conversations like this, so do other people. And I think that the fact that my friend Ron Esmoglu and I won the Nobel Prize for historical economic research, and that we work on these issues of AI development and future now, I think that's helps us reach more people. And I think this is what you need. You need a global discussion. You need to argue about legitimacy and what's right and what's wrong. And you need to follow what develops. And you need to be angry when you should be angry and delighted when you should be delighted. So I think a values-based discussion from civil society, NAF, is exactly what we need. And we do have that now. I think, NAF, what I say to people in this context, related context, is there is one thing you can be sure about, which is the government is not coming to save you. And I think we can spend some hours or minutes or maybe just a few seconds feeling bad about that. And then I think when you know that, NAF, when you realize that we're on our own, it's about civil society, it's about us as individuals, it's about our talents, it's about our abilities, it's about our willingness to engage with each other, it's about caring for each other, leaving the governments to one side. I think that, and it's about what can be empowered with the technology. I think, NAF, we can get to a better place, because this is not the world of colonial empires or the world of the early industrialization in Manchester, or even the world of countries struggling to be independent after World War II. And we have a lot of smart people around the world, a lot of people who understand technology and can develop technology. And if they feel empowered and driven, and if they can access the resources, I think we can build much better things. And if we build them without the government, now, if we build them for civil society, we build them for you and for Oxfam and for the people you care about, then the next time the government changes anywhere and somebody comes in and says, you know what, we're cutting all foreign aid programs, it won't hurt people as much. Because if you depend on government, NAF, and government lets you down, you've got a big problem. And we're seeing that in the United States. That's exactly what we're seeing. So the idea that the government is the solution to your problems has, I think, become increasingly problematic in recent decades for various reasons. And it is just, that idea has just manifestly, completely and utterly failed in a dreadful way, in a way that's awfully embarrassing to the United States and to what we claim to stand for.
Thank you so much, Simon. Powerful way to end it. For me and Grazielle, we spend a lot of time working on what are the ways to alleviate or eradicate poverty. But we're also really interested in the AI conversation because it's timely, and we can also see the danger and also, the promises. So thank you so much, Simon, for making the time to talk to us.
Well, thank you, Naf, and thank you, Grazielle. It's a real pleasure and, in fact, a great honor to speak with you. And I would say that your attitude and approach is exactly right. So the world has many problems, and we need to call them out, identify them, and work on them. And I think to the extent AI expands our abilities, enhances our capabilities to deal with those problems, that's a good thing. And we just have to head in that direction.
Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of the episode. What stood out for you, Naf?
Wow, Grazielle, that was amazing. To be honest, a lot to take in. So where do I start? I think, one thing that really stood out for me is this whole vision thing with AI. Who gets to decide how AI is used? Because, whoever is going to be in the driver's seat is basically designing our political, social, and economic future. And right now, it's mostly Silicon Valley folks, calling the shots. So are we just living in their version of the world? And, connected with this, I really loved how Simon talked about the importance of designing AI or any technology for that matter with intention. He was talking about intended consequences, outcomes. Yeah. So what's the goal here? What problem are we actually trying to resolve? And I think we, as a society, seriously need to sit down and have a real talk about this.
I totally agree with you, Naf. I do believe everyone needs to think about this, to take the time to think, to read about it, to understand, to talk with each other. And as a society, to build on a position, to build on guidance on AI, because this has an effect on all of us. And we don't want to live in a reality that was planned by others and that we have no participation.
Definitely, grazie. And I think, this is why everyone needs to be deeply concerned about AI. And, we need to start asking ourselves the right questions because this will help us shape our path forward. So thank you so much for listening to us today. If you want to dive deeper, please check out Simon's book, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity.
We would love to hear your thoughts. Please connect with us on social media, equals Reimagining Our Economy on LinkedIn, and subscribe to our newsletter at equals.inc for updates on inequality and how to fight it.
Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye bye.